Incidents are unplanned investments. When we have an incident, all kinds of money goes into dealing with that incident in all kinds of ways. Engineer hours, absolutely. Think about when you have to escalate, how many more people that you have to bring into that incident. And then think about if you don't do a good learning review, which ties into the practice of practice concept very closely, you're going to get to another incident. You're going to repeat the same mistakes.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 161, Why Incidents Are Slowing Down Companies. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. At the time of recording, a very large online SaaS is having problems, let's say, that are affecting many other people.
Positively or negatively?
It depends. I'll go ahead and name it. For some people, I believe it's very positive. For other people, it's very negative. And what I'm talking about right at the moment is Jira Cloud. And HugOps and everything else to the people at Atlassian, I don't wish that upon anybody. But we all like poking fun at Jira, right, Victor? Not just Jira, but everybody. We like poking fun at everybody.
Especially Jira.
Especially Jira, right? Just because it's Jira, right? And, you know, the upside of this is they're going to be probably getting a lot of press, some that they didn't want, but hey, at least Jira is going to be even better known. But how do we handle these kinds of incidents when it not just affects us, but other people?
I don't know. It's tricky. At least in my case, whenever I was in situations that I was handling incidents or handling people handling incidents, I was on both sides. There are two very opposing things. One is, hey, I should be fixing this. And the other one, what the heck is going on? Which are the things that traditionally, at least, and very often in practice, are conflicting with one another, right? You know, you're doing something and then, hey, what's the status? I mean, if you ask me status one more time, I'm going to strangle you type of answer, right? And then on the other hand, when I was on the other side, kind of managing people who are, among other things, working on incidences, I cannot be blind. I cannot not know what's going on, right? So it's a bit of a tricky situation, for me at least.
And to sort of cover a little bit more of why incidents are slowing down companies, and in this story of Atlassian and Jira Cloud, not only slowing themselves down, but slowing down everybody else that subscribes to their service, we have a couple of people on today from Blameless. We have Matt and Jake on. Guys, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having us on.
So I'm going to go ahead and let both of you, and we'll start with Matt first, and Jake, you can go second. Go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit more, and then you guys pick between yourselves how you want to go ahead and set up, sort of explain quickly about, what Blameless is, just as a nickel tour real quick. But then let's get in and talk about why incidents are, going back to Victor's example, these competing potentially issues of people want status, but yet the people that have to give the status are the same people that actually have to resolve the problems. So Matt, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, my name is Matt Davis. I am a staff infrastructure engineer at Blameless, and my responsibilities center around observability and a lot of our data pipelines, metrics, and monitoring that we use to actually run the Blameless product. I am in the SRE team at Blameless. Even though my title isn't SRE, that's what we're all about.
And I'm Jake Englund. I'm a senior site reliability engineer at Blameless. I've worn a lot of different hats in throughout my career, from software engineer to platform engineer, infrastructure engineer, but really kind of centering around software engineering when it wasn't a SRE role itself. With experience at some companies like Wizards of the Coast was one that I really enjoyed, but also 5 years at Google, which is where I even learned what SRE was. And so, kind of got to develop things from there. But, my responsibilities at Blameless so far is I'm still learning and scoping a lot of things there, as I've been there for 6 months. But one of the things that I'm excited about and have gotten to dig into a bunch is just around our network infrastructure and the things that the way that we design our platform to help improve its reliability and give the best service we can to our customers. And a lot of that also kind of revolves around just keeping things up to date and modern.
Modern and SRE seems like they should be probably completely opposite of each other. I don't want cutting edge in my monitoring tools.
Yeah, but wait, stop. If SREs as a term exists only for a small number of years, then it cannot not be modern.
Well, it's interesting because I hear what you're saying. I don't want cutting edge in something that I place so much importance on. At the same time, being cutting edge in that area allows us to gain better knowledge and better understanding of some things. So I think it's a balance. You can be cutting edge in some areas of observability and reliability, and be tried and true and traditional in other areas.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I really dislike, this is not the area to be cutting edge used as an excuse all the time. Kind of, hey, we're not going to go cloud because this is about being reliable. We're not going to do cutting edge, no Kubernetes, no virtual machines, not even Linux. Even that's cutting edge, kind of. To me, that's very often. I'm not saying that everybody should go cutting edge, kind of like whatever was released yesterday. But that's more often than not an excuse, at least from my perspective.
The opposite is even probably worse. Not staying up to date, like Jake was just saying. A lot of what he's been doing very recently has been exactly this, like moving us from, traditional pieces of the infrastructure, several versions behind. We're trying to maintain that balance, actually. The balance between, it's not broken, don't fix it, and, we need to stay on the cutting edge to be able to gain the benefits from it so that we cannot be slowed down when we have incidents, because the incidents are not going to stop, but we can do better at handling them.
Absolutely. And another thing I wanted to throw on, though, is security updates are one that you don't get to really decide about, I think, is that, when those come out, you really do want to try to do that. And sometimes that forces your hand in terms of, infrastructure that you depended on or were pegged to a particular version. And then suddenly, you've got a log4j situation even, and then, that could really shift priorities. So at least having the capacity to be able to become cutting edge in the ways that you need to, especially when security's on the line, can really, it's interesting to see how that can actively impact priorities and prioritization within an organization, even within the same quarter, it can really shift things.
So let's get back to our sort of thesis. Why do you think incidents are slowing down companies? I mean, obviously we can guess, but does it really go deeper than just it slows them down? What other side effects are happening?
It's something that I always love to talk about to start. And actually, I'm so happy that you even talked about, the difficulty of like flying blind, or when you're a manager and you're trying to look in on an incident and you're not getting a lot of response because anybody with any like technical know-how is digging into what is going wrong right now. And there is this, cognitive burden to switching between responding and problem solving to being able to communicate what you're learning out to another party. Even in our own incidents, I find myself often jumping into incidents that I'm not on call for just to help supplement the communications, to understand what's going on. Because it's often a learning opportunity for me, but then to also just help facilitate that communication outward. But that also means that I'm spending my engineering hours on that as well. And so for as much as it may facilitate it, is that there's still a larger investment in responding to that incident.
So what's the solution then? Do we choose one of the two? Kind of like document but don't fix it but don't not document? Or
I'm glad you said the word document, because this makes me think of documentation. We always leave documentation to the last. I mean, we try to include documentation in what we build, right? We try to put in notes, we try to put in how-tos, readmes, update the wiki, runbook's updated. We got to keep all our documents updated. So we know that we can do that the best if we make that documentation part of the process, right? So I think one of the reasons that companies do slow down when they have incidents might be because they don't practice doing incidents enough. So that every time they get to an incident, it's like they're at the end of that sprint and they like, oh, I got to put a README in. Oh, I got to put a document. I got to document this before I close the ticket. So when we get to an incident, it's kind of the same way. It kind of surprises us. We're like, what did we do last time? How are we organizing? Contact this person. 2 hours later, the person responds. And it's just like, we don't practice it enough. So when we get into the incident, I hate to use the word panic, but that's kind of what happens sometimes. That people will start panicking and they don't know what to do. And that actually draws the whole thing out. And then remediation and then coming back. Should we look at action items? Should we do a full-scale incident analysis? Are we going to learn from that? And cutting those off because we think we don't have time for them actually means that the next time we get hit with an incident, we're spending more time in the incident because we didn't invest the time to begin with. I don't know. I kind of feel that way about it.
There is additional complication, right? If I would be talking about documenting whatever you're doing while writing an application, right? I strongly believe that there is no excuse not to document it while you're doing it, because your memory does not serve you. If you don't document it while you're doing it, it's never going to be documented, at least not properly, right? But when we're talking about incidences, and I'm not now trying to say that it should be like this or that, there is that, okay, not maybe panic, but there is a time essence there, right? Like this needs to be finished sooner than later. And again, I'm not saying that should be excused not to document it, but I can understand why the world is crashing on top of my head and I want to protect myself. I want to fix the ceiling before actually I start writing about the structural integrity of my roof, right?
That's absolutely true. And the difficulty coming with even like when to prioritize the time for documentation, but then also on retrospectives, as Matt was talking about with, the time you spend learning from an incident is that like you made one thing that I find so remarkable in the space of even like some companies may get like your on-call may get paged once or twice in a week or on a shift, but other companies, it may be nearly, you might have stuff every hour, maybe even more than that. You might have some serious pager burnout. But then that kind of dictates also the, how fresh everything is in your head. But, as you're saying, your memory doesn't serve you. Is that I'm absolutely writing that documentation for myself because in 6 months, I am going to forget what it is. Like that is such an important part for me, especially in being able to respond to that faster or help somebody else who's working on something that I've worked on in the past. But it is such a challenge to prioritize documentation, especially in the demand of so much feature work and bug fixes, and also just the toil and being on call, or just whatever things come up, you have that adaptive capacity for. It's a very hard struggle to figure out the prioritization there. I wish I had a better answer for it.
Here's the thing, really, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? I'm not really worried whether, and I'm now talking exclusively about incidences, whether I'm documenting things, to pick a word, in a way that it is readable by managers. I'm not necessarily worried about that. I'm more worried of whether all the information that is flowing and everything that is going on is actually, whether that is documented, right? So later on, I can come and write a report as long as I have all the information. Okay, this is what was said. This is what was executed. This is what was... this button was pushed, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not necessarily, at least in my head, about documenting, but really collecting all the information that you might need later on to document it properly, whether that will be a guide, whether that would be a report for CTO who is calling you every 5 minutes or whatever else, right? Where do you stand on that?
Yes, so collecting the data. So kind of a theme that I think is formulating here is the fact that when we get into an incident, it's more than what one person can handle. We've got someone who is the first responder, someone who was, they're on call, they got the page, they responded to the page. That person may not be the technician that can fix the problem. And as Jake was describing before, in fact, a very recent incident, this happened to me. I was on call, so I was the first responder, and I was the one who could mitigate the incident. So what I had no time to do was collect data. I didn't have time to communicate out to my colleagues. I didn't have, the headspace, the cognitive space to be able to even think that I should be doing that, because I'm in the tunnel. I've got my kind of tunnel vision on the incident, and whatever happens with me in the incident may not get out to the other people. So having a tool to help you be able to corral all of this together is really critical. Companies have this. They try to collaborate on a Google Doc or something, or they'll just use a Slack channel. What a tool can help you do is, hey, someone else can actually be assigned the communications lead role. And so I don't have to worry about that. As the mitigator, or as the responder, or whatever, as the technician in charge of doing technical fixing things, I don't have to worry about comms at all, because I know that there's a communications lead who has been assigned in the incident. That is their role. So I can have trust that that person is going to go do that. The same goes for a general incident commander role. I can't be an incident commander when I'm fixing something. Same with being a communications lead type of person. I can't do both. Maybe in small incidents I can. Maybe our lowest severity level is Sev 3. So maybe during a Sev 3, production pressure isn't as great. Something, stuff isn't wildly broken. I have a little bit of time, a little bit of slack time to give me the ability to, okay, I've applied a fix. I'm going to go around and I'm going to tell a few people, maybe see who I can pull in to the incident. I need some help, or I need a communication to go out. With big incidents, it really does help to have individuals assume those individual roles so that you can work as a team.
I like that. But here's a question. You said you were fixing an incident, you're in a tunnel, right? How do you prevent those other roles from actually pulling you out of the tunnel? If you understand what I mean, kind of like, hey, what's the status? Okay, what are you doing right now, by the way?
I think it's going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on the person, what's happening to the person at the time, what else might be going on to that person, even just physically where they are. Are they comfortable being able to do what they can do? All of these cognitive aspects of what we do feed into our ability to operate the incident, right? So some people can take that cognitive load. Hey, what's the status, Matt? I'm working on this right now. But sometimes people won't have that ability. Oftentimes, I will lean on other team members. I'm using myself just because I'm thinking about that incident that I was in. I will lean on the other team members even if they don't have specific roles assigned. We've learned to work together, and we've actually practiced some of these things in an external session. So when we get into an incident, we're kind of in that mode, and we already know, okay, I know that Matt's going to need help fielding questions about status, and I'm going to lean in and I'm going to do that. And so I think it's part of building that teamwork, to be honest with you.
I know a strategy that I use is that I try to rubber duck to whatever chat channel we're trying to coordinate communications on for it. That at least if I'm trying to explain to the chat channel what it is that I'm thinking, to the extent that I can write those messages, is that at least provides the insight for somebody else like that comms lead to then be able to pick out of that what we think the situation is. Of course, one challenge with this is oftentimes I have hypotheses that are completely wrong, and that isn't stuff that I want somebody else to be able to then pick up and necessarily magnify, because that might take things off in in the wrong direction. But so, being able to have a little bit of a selective filter for here's literally everything going through my head to at least try to give that comms lead more to work with. But also, I often find it really helps in situations where I'm not the only one responding to an incident. And so just trying to share as much insight as I can give about what I'm seeing. That's one of the strategies that works for me, even though there is definitely some like added overhead to it. But to Matt's point, practice helps a lot. And it's one of the things that is such a it's this like contradiction with incidents, is because it's the unfamiliarity with incidents that makes it worse, and what you kind of need is more incidents. But it's not like you're necessarily going to want to just blow up your architecture. So how do you get that kind of practice in order to cultivate that kind of experience? And one of the things that I love about Matt, and we may be able to get to talk about this, is that Matt dedicates time every week to giving us some space to be able to talk about and practice some different things without that pressure of there being an active incident.
Tell me more. I want to hear about that.
I'll start off by saying, when we're in incidents, like I was talking about before, with cognitive pressure and everything that's going on around us, we oftentimes, our memory fails us, or I don't have those notes in front of me, and so we're leaning on our intuitions a lot, especially if it's a really high-pressure situation, like our service went down. And not only is our service down for us to be able to respond, our service is down for other people to be able to respond to their own stuff. So we need to fix this immediately, and that means we're going to be leaning on our intuition to do it. We got to move fast. We got to use that kind of ingrained knowledge that we've understood of the system, right? Well, that's hard to get in an incident when it's such high pressure. So the idea is to get those kinds of things outside of the incident. So what we do is we have a weekly session. It's called Practice of Practice Gamelan. And the words to key on there are practice of practice. And what we do every week in the practice of practice is we examine our regular work, we look at our systems, and we treat it as a playtime. We learn about systems and gain understanding with our systems by doing things that are real. They feel real. As an example, when we get into this session every week, we may talk about something like, we may go around the Zoom and, we have like a spinner wheel. It's usually right up here. And we'll spin around and we'll get a word, and then we'll have to describe something about the service. And we will have to go in and show people parts of the service that we're talking about. So we may have to share our screen and then show people what we're doing. And this tends to let people think about it. So we're not in an incident. So we're not having our intuitions pressed upon us. We're in a space where we can take our time. We can breathe through the questions. We can go, hey, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that service talked to all those other different services. Can we dig into how those actually talk to each other? Or, oh, I wasn't aware that tool could do that. Or I wasn't aware that this is how you locate the storage for a specific customer. This is an example that actually happened to us. So we had a session. Jake is nodding his head because he was on call when this happened. And we had a session just a couple weeks before where we had talked about, I forget what the actual impetus of the question was, but through our discussion of looking through our storage buckets, we together, maybe individuals knew different pieces of how this system worked, but none of us knew the whole system. And I'm talking about the storage system itself. So as a group, as a team, we were together without pressure, diving into that system, learning, oh, that's how that hash value shows up. Oh, this is how we can tell that it's customer XYZ and not, something else that we use. And it was a really fulfilling thing. Like, we came out of that session like, wow, I've learned something new about our complexity. Well, I think it was not but 2 weeks later that we had a specific problem with this very subsystem. And instead of losing time, why do incidents slow us down? So I would say losing time slows us down. Instead of losing the time of figuring out, okay, I don't know anything about the system, and Jake would have been in this position if we had not had the session, but he wasn't surprised in the middle of the incident. He was surprised by the incident, but he wasn't surprised by knowing the system. So because we had done this, because we had practiced in our session how all these things talk together, what they look like, what they're named, how they work, in the incident, Jake and the team were able to get to a conclusion, in my opinion, much faster. The conclusion was actually we need to roll back, but it took us, instead of us going 2 or 3 hours, do we really need to roll back? Can we roll forward? Blah, 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 blah. In a fairly short amount of time, less than an hour, maybe less than a half an hour, we got to the decision, you know what? We've identified this absolutely. We know exactly what we're talking about because we practiced this. Roll back. And we rolled back and the incident was mitigated. And it's a great example because I was just like so thrilled that it happened within this like basically 2 weeks. We practiced this very subject and it came up in an incident. And yeah, we saved time because we did that.
That reminds me, in a way, and this might sound strange, of chaos engineering. Very often when people talk about chaos engineering, it's finding the limits of your system. That's not my main preoccupation. In my head, chaos engineering is more about figuring out actually what happens when something happens, kind of like why this happens when I do that, which from the, not necessarily from the practice perspective, but from the objective perspective sounds very similar to what you're doing, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the interesting thing about chaos engineering is that it is a form of practice. It is a form of this practice of practice, as opposed to like doing like a tabletop game where you kind of fake it. You make up a scenario and then you try to, act out on that scenario. That's what I would call a hypothetical, right? Whereas chaos engineering or the practice of practice sessions that we run, they're not hypotheticals. They're real things. And so we're learning about real things. And so in order for us to enable chaos in a system, well, we have to understand what we're doing first. And so it's the same process. You're absolutely right. Just like the work that it takes to get yourself led up to the point where you've run a chaos experiment is exactly the same kind of work that we do when we talk about the practice of practice. It's the things that we do in our regular work. It is the work is done. It is everything about the sharp end and what we're getting into. We haven't done too much chaos engineering at Blameless yet, but the practice of practice session that we have is exactly where we would do it. It's along the exact same lines.
What do you say to companies or individuals that don't want to practice? Obviously, that's a very short-sighted item. One of the other things I want to call out too, maybe you can roll it in here, and I think it goes along with that, is you have been using sports analogies without using sports analogies. We've learned to work together. You've got an incident commander. You've got first responder. Okay, maybe not sports analogies, but firefighters, policemen,
music.
Those kinds of...
Specifically, it's a music, yeah.
It's music, yeah. So we have all those things. But yet you get into large companies, enterprises, it's like, well, that's not helping our bottom line any. We'll just deal with it when it happens. What do you have to say to people like that?
So incidents are unplanned investments. When we have an incident, all kinds of money goes into dealing with that incident, and in all kinds of ways. Engineer hours, absolutely. Think about when you have to escalate, how many more people that you have to bring into that incident. And then think about if you don't do a good learning review, which ties into the practice of practice concept very closely, you're going to get to another incident. You're going to repeat. You're going to repeat the same mistakes. You're going to have to call people in, and it's a music analogy for a reason. And sports works too. If you're not a musician, you can definitely think sports here. You could even think dance. Anything that is a real-time activity where it emerges, just like an incident, just like a complex system, it's emerging. So what happens if we don't practice when we're in sports or when we're in music or in dance? Well, maybe we get lucky, and that's great. We get lucky, we play all the right notes, we never practiced once, and oh my God, this is the greatest sight-reading jazz band I've ever seen in my life. We know music isn't like that, though. We know sports isn't like that either. If teams don't practice together, then they're not going to win the Super Bowl. They're not going to win another championship that I can't think of because I'm not a huge sports person. But you know what I mean. It's like the intuitions and the ability of people to get together and work as teams is not limited to sports, music, and arts. We do it in our jobs, in our work. So if we don't make the space for our teams to work together and learn how to work together and learn the system at the same time, then you're gonna repeat mistakes over and over and over again. Now, yeah, you may get lucky and you may be able to get your hands around that big incident, but you may not be so lucky when you get to the next big incident. So it is a very important thing to think about.
There is a part of practicing so that you can avoid incidences or that you can respond better to incidences, but also depending on what you, but incidences are going to happen, right? Whether you like it or not. Now, depending on how you approach the incidents, it can be a cost or it can be actually investment, right? It can be, hey, we just spent 2 days, 5 people fixing this thing, and that was a complete waste. Or it can be seen, depending on how you approach it, right? Hey, actually, because of this thing that happened and shouldn't have happened, now we know that we should do X, Y, Z that will make it faster, better, more reliable, right? It can be turned around, that incidences are investments in a way of how to improve something.
Something that comes to mind is I heard somebody, an engineering manager, and I don't know where, start referring to the costs around incidents as tuition. And I really just started to love that analogy because when you think of it too, is it like when you have an active like P1, P0 type incident, you can think of that kind of like as like a Harvard level of tuition, the pressures on that kind of thing. Versus like when you get to practice on, when there isn't an active incident and nothing's on fire and not losing customers and losing money, it's more like community college level tuition. But the thing is that you can still learn so much in either context if you're prepared for it and if you have the resources you need there. And so to the people that, I say, if you don't want to invest now for those instances you're going to have later, you're going to be paying a lot more money later on. Your tuition is going to be a lot higher, especially because it's going to be this active thing that you're going to have to be like doing all your prereqs at, or, not necessarily you can transfer everything, but you kind of get the idea, is that you can get a lot of your like requirements out of the way somewhere else and then transfer over instead of needing to spend all that money on all that time and all that energy during the big incident is kind of like how I like to think of it.
I've never heard that analogy, Jake. That's really awesome. I love that. I love the idea there of you're carrying it over. It's like okay, I'm going to carry what I learned in community college into my 4-year degree,
And that's exactly how I felt about our the cabinet stuff for storage, is that I felt like I took a class on this already and I immediately got to solve it. And it saved us so much money as a result, just in terms of like, we don't have to worry about this anymore. We know what the problem is just because I knew where to look. Not to mention the burnout factor is a lot lower when I can feel confident in incident response. So I think that's something really important to note too, is that having your engineers feel confident during incident response has untold benefits for job satisfaction.
Yeah. I was just going to say something similar, that, no two incidents are going to be alike. So if you think that you have learned in incident A, XYZ, when you get to incident B, you're not going to be prepared for the fact that it's QPR, not XYZ, that causes the incident. Oh, but we were in that incident. That incident looked exactly like this incident, but XYZ is not involved. So what happened to that investment? That kind of brings in the question like, well, what can we learn outside of the incident? And I was going to say, Jake, being able to understand your system is the other side benefit of this. We're not just preparing ourselves for incidents. We're making our systems successful. I mean, we want our systems to be successful most of the time, right? So when our system fails, we have an opportunity to learn something, not just prepare ourselves for the next failure, but we have the opportunity. Basically, the system has opened itself up and is saying, this is how I work in this section. I bet you didn't know that. And so now we've learned something from the system, and then we can take that back to our designs. We can take that back to the way that we run the organization. We can take that back and learn things about how we can do on-call better and how we can support our teammates better. Those are all more important questions than we have to be prepared for X, Y, and Z.
If a team is preparing for the next failure, but that same team has high rates of turnover, is that team ever going to be successful?
That's a good question. I think there can be a lot of reasons for high rates of turnover. So I'm going to assume that maybe it's not a negative reason that there's high rates of turnover.
Let's say it's an organizational reason that they only allow people to stay in this role within this team for 3 months. So they have a constant turnover for that reason alone, not for necessarily a negative.
Then I think the teamwork is even more important. I think it's even more critical. When I think about a situation like that, I think upward, and I'm thinking, why is this like this? Is it because we're, switching people around? People are like doing some kind of like a tour. I'm going to do a tour in the NOC for 3 months. I'm going to do a tour as an SRE for 3 months and learn everything about what they have to. I mean, there is only so much that you can like absorb in a short amount of time, right? We have to find other things to lean on. I said it before. I would rather us have to deal with ambiguity in the incident, not ambiguity with the tooling and the frameworks and the people and the teams that we have. So doubling down, especially if it's designed that way, or if it's just a team that experiences a lot of high turnover anyway, like it's really important to really open up the communications channel like wide open, like the highest amount of transparency as possible in a team like that is going to be what you need. On the other hand, there may be other things at work here about why this team is having such high turnover, and maybe dealing with incidents isn't the actual problem that needs to be dealt with.
The immediate thing that comes to mind to me is that it's going to be really important to streamline those onboarding and offboarding processes if there's a lot of turnover too, and that's going to be one of the most, especially the onboarding process is going to be one of the most critical areas for instilling any institutional knowledge in order to be effective during that 3-month period. So just figuring out so I think about it like automating any other process is just like, well, if you're doing it that often, I'm almost thinking like let's encrypt at this point and just like doing certificate management. Is that like if you're doing it that often, it's really nice if we can do it, in a very automatic fashion. But then thinking about what goes into that, I feel like there would have to be a tremendous investment to make up for the fact that you're kind of evaporating institutional knowledge all the time, unless, again, cultures around documenting things well and making things easy to find and discover are the things that you're going to have to really lean on to be successful on a team. But I just think about 3 months, and I know so often for myself as an engineer, maybe I could be effective within 3 months, but kind of or within the first 3 months. I think the fastest I've ever felt like I've been productive anywhere was 1 month in. But, at most places, it's closer to 6 months before I feel like I'm really being productive and contributing. So being under that kind of pressure with that kind of turnover, I would just be amazed at the kinds of, to people who can manage that successfully, I would want to know everything that you've done to be able to manage that, because it would be an exceptional case of some things that are really challenging for teams that have much lower rates of turnover to deal with. Losing any amount of institutional knowledge can be a challenge, depending on exactly what is lost and how it got lost.
If we think of maybe what would be a more realistic example is just high rates of turnover because you're hiring heavy. So you're hiring and hiring mistakes happen. And that happens. And then people leave, people switch teams. Maybe you're a very dynamic company and and this is the kind of situation that you're in. I go back to the transparency and the importance of collaboration and communication. The tooling does help. The tooling is going to help us get to those places. The tooling is the thing for me that removes ambiguity for us as operators. So if we can remove ambiguity with the tooling, then what do we clear up our cognition to do? Work together. Do things that are more collaborative and more communicative and more outreaching. I think part of the role of a great reliability engineering program is that it involves the whole company. That knowledge doesn't need to stay in that SRE team. In fact, it might even be beneficial if someone from software engineering side came over and did a 3-month tour in SRE and takes some of that knowledge back to their team with them. So I think that's really valuable.
As we're starting to wrap up, obviously you guys are from a vendor called Blameless, and you were saying the tool makes the difference. Where does Blameless fit into all of this?
So Blameless is really wants, we pitch ourselves as an end-to-end SRE platform, but you can really think of it, especially in what our a lot of our focus and core functionality is around, is incident management and incident response. But that's much more holistic than just the incident itself. It's also about runbook documentation, retrospectives, reliability insights, but also features on top of incident management that can be bootstrapped onto anything that's maybe a process for your company, like communication flows, so that you can just make sure that the people who need to be involved for whatever type of incident you're having, whether it's an outage, whether it's something like you have just employee onboarding, could be something that could be an incident, especially as these may relate together and involve a lot of different teams, that Blameless is one place where we make a lot of tools and a lot of integrations to help just pull information together so that like you can communicate on incident response in Slack or in MS Teams, and that can all end up in an incident report that then you can be able to look at, analyze, annotate, do things with that. We can apply tags to it. And then also, delegate roles and make it very obvious to everybody who's in charge on things. Even just one of those challenges in an incident is knowing who are the right people to talk to. As I know that like Matt is the person who's our incident commander and maybe the operations lead, but is he the right person to talk to if I want a status update? No, actually it may be this other person that has that role. Making that very clear and very open communication so anybody in the company can be aware that an incident's going on, that the people who need to be looped in can be, and that the people who are actively working on the incidents or on whatever response is required for whatever it is you're doing, just have a really great place to coordinate. Because often, as we talked about, like opening up a Google Doc and having your incident response be there, but you're not having chats in your Google Doc, and being able to preserve that conversation can be a really helpful part, especially of your retrospective process and understanding what your product does. So that's one of the things that I especially love about Blameless and getting to use it now that I'm at Blameless. And I didn't hear about Blameless until I interviewed at the company, and I have just been in love with the product ever since because it makes the type of work that we do, especially on this high pressure incident response work, it makes it easier. And every ounce of cognitive load that I can take off of my brain when I am trying to figure out what's wrong with the system is just better for everybody, better for me, and it's better for the people I'm working with.
It's also better to be able to point at something. It's better to be able to, instead of talking about an incident as a collection of a bunch of different things, Blameless helps us put all of those different things together, especially the timeline, the highlights, the tagging, and the people. And you can see in the Blameless interface when you're looking at our timeline view of the incident, the list of people involved are right there in plain sight, and all of their roles are listed next to them. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying remove the ambiguity from the process. And that's what Blameless helps us do. It helps us remove the ambiguity from like, who's telling people what, and who's working on it, and who's this lead and who's that lead. That's a bunch of corporate overhead that we don't need and we don't have to worry about because the tool helps us guide us as a framework through the incident. I especially like Blameless because it helps me put knowledge into one place instead of like, oh, I DM'd someone there and I had a Slack thread over here and I had a phone conversation there and a Zoom thing there. I like how Blameless will give us a single Slack channel, so then I can direct people to that Slack channel. I can direct people to the incident timeline page. And it just kind of like helps me with all of that overhead that I don't want to have to worry about as a responder or as a technician. And that's why I really like it.
I like how you said, and I can see the names of all the people involved. And now there is at least one manager somewhere saying, amazing. Now I know whom to fire.
You know what though? It's funny, but part of the concept of being blameless is being vulnerable and being able to join that Slack channel and know that there's not a manager who's going to do that. Being able to join the Slack channel and feeling safe to be able to say, I don't know, let me go find someone who does, or just give input or theories or whatever. That's what Blameless is about. Blameless is not so much about not pointing fingers. For us, it's more about having agency as an individual and feeling like we're working together as a team, so that when someone does make a mistake, we're there to support them. We're not there to sanction them. That's the big difference that I think that Blameless makes.
All of Jake's and Matt's contact information are going to be down in the show notes. Guys, thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.